Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eve Samples, Executive Director at Friends of the Everglades. I'm here with my colleague Gil Smart of Friends of the Everglades and VoteWater. And we're going to be talking to you today about the legislative session that just ended earlier this month on May 5th. There is a lot to unpack from this session. A lot of bills were flying, a lot of bills advanced, some good bills didn't. We're going to break it down for you in terms of what impacts the environment and specific the greater Everglades that our mission is to protect. So before we jump in and get started here, a few housekeeping items. I just want to thank the Tierney and Wetzel Foundation, which sponsors our Friends of the Everglades live events. We're really grateful for their support for our legislative accountability work in general. You may have noticed more communication from us on bills. We really try hard to help you understand dense policy measures, and our grant from the Tierney and Wetzel Foundation makes that possible. We're very grateful. And legislative accountability is really vital to environmental protection in the future of Florida. Tallahassee is a distant city from most of us in Florida, and yet the policies that our lawmakers, our elected officials advance and pass in Tallahassee have a direct impact on our lives. Gil and I were talking recently about how national politics really can consume and just suck up all the air in a room. But arguably, what happens in Tallahassee has a more direct impact on our lives and our waterways, certainly. So we'll be talking about that today. If you're watching us live, either on YouTube or Facebook, feel free to post questions in the comments. We can see those, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of our time together. We're going to be on for about an hour discussing the recent session. And without further ado, I just want to officially introduce Gil Smart. Gil and I have worked together in this realm for several years, and before that, we worked together as journalists. And there are a lot of similarities in terms of what we did then and what we do now, and that involves that accountability work I was talking about. So, Gil, Executive Director of VoteWater and also Policy Director of Friends of the Everglades, officially welcome.
Thank you. And yeah, as you just noted a few minutes ago, we follow the Florida legislature because what the Florida legislature does exerts such an impact on the day-to-day ecological health of the state of Florida and our waterways and the Everglades in particular. That's what we're following specifically. But it really calls for scrutiny because a lot of it is so dense. All right, a lot of it is so difficult, I think, for the layman to understand. And that's where it's important to break it down so people understand exactly what's going on up in Tallahassee, exactly what the bills that they've passed or are passing are going to mean to you. And if you fish, if you're on the water, if you just love the Everglades, if you just value the natural world, every single year in Tallahassee, there's legislation being passed that's going to affect that natural world. It's important to know what the effect's going to be, to try to stop it if it's bad, to try to boost it if it's good. That's what this legislative accountability project is all about, and I hope we've accomplished that this year.
Very well put, Gil. Thanks. So I'm just going to give a quick recap of the legislative session that just ended in Tallahassee, and then Gil's going to go into some more details about the bills we've been tracking. If you'd like to follow along at home, you can go to our website, everglades.org, where we just debuted our post-session report under our Legislative Accountability tab. So here's where we are. Legislative session began March 7th. It ended May 5th. So every year, lawmakers convene for a 60-day annual session. Sometimes they have special sessions in addition to that, as we saw late last year. But this was their main annual session. And as I mentioned, the bills were flying. A number of bad bills came out the gate that were really concerning and directly undercut local government's ability to rein in water pollution issues. Luckily, the worst of those fizzled out. However, we're going to talk about some bad bills that did advance. We also had some good bills that went absolutely nowhere. You guys may have heard about the state's Blue-Green Algae Task Force. This is a group that's been meeting since 2019. They've put out great recommendations. The vast majority of those recommendations have not been adopted. There was a bill to adopt more. It went nowhere. We're going to get into some more details on that. And then the most pressing issue for those of you listening right now are some bills that are sitting on Governor DeSantis's desk as we speak. They were passed by the legislature, sent to the governor for either signature or veto. And in 3 of those cases, we are pressing the governor to veto bills. And there's one bill in particular related to sprawl and growth management that we put real pressure on the governor to veto because it directly undercuts Everglades restoration and environmental protection in Florida. So we're going to talk about that as we go along here. One more thing I'll point to is our 4 legislative priorities that we set out at the start of session. So we issued a report before session started in March, articulating what we would like to see the legislature do in order to protect our waterways and the Everglades and our green spaces, habitat, public health even. And they boil down to 4 things. Take steps to protect and advance cleaner water policies. Number 2, restore more wetlands to send more water south of Lake Okeechobee to the Everglades, restoring the river of grass that we talk about and love. Smarter controlled development is number 3, and stopping sugarcane burning is number 4. So those are the things we care most deeply about. We did not see significant progress on most of those, all of those arguably. In fact, we saw attempts to undermine some of those that we're working to stop now. So without further ado, Gil, I'll kick it over to you to walk us through the particulars on this front.
Very good. Yeah, I would say we saw a regression on some of that. In particular, what we're about to talk about now. Hang on a second as I share my screen. Okay. And here, to go back to the term that we've been using all session long, the session of sprawl. This session, from the get-go, it almost seemed like a concerted attack, so to speak, by the sprawl industry, the development industry in Florida, because there were numerous bills right out of the gate that we tagged, and others did as well, as being detrimental, as being would contribute to reckless growth and sort of less comprehensive planning, less sound planning, and more problems that stem from growth. The biggest one that made it through the process, and this has now been sent to Governor DeSantis's desk for his signature, Sprawl Bill 540, Senate Bill 540. As you see here, this is bad for water, bad for the Everglades, bad for Florida. Senate Bill 540 revolves around a provision that says that if you, as a citizen, decide you're going to challenge your local comprehensive plan or an amendment to your local comprehensive plan, say passed by your county commissioners to facilitate development in an area that previously development wasn't allowed or development was restricted. If you challenge a comprehensive plan amendment like that and you lose, you have to pay the, quote, prevailing party's legal fees. The prevailing party would be the municipality or the county that you sue, but it could also be what are called interveners, which could be deep-pocketed developers who sign on to the case, meaning that if you lose a challenge to an amendment like this, you could be on the hook for 6 figures worth of legal fees. Okay, it's going to be prohibitive. The concern is that this is going to deter people, virtually everyone, from filing any such fees, because this would apply not only if you lost, your first level of appeal would be to an administrative law judge, but depending on what happens there, it can be appealed to the governor's. It's the governor and his cabinet. Which is not famous for, upholding rulings that tend to favor citizens over developers. So basically, the concern is with this bill that this would effectively end citizen challenges to comprehensive plan amendments in Florida. Very few people or public interest organizations are going to want to take the chance that they lose and have to pay a ton in the other side's legal fees. Friends of the Everglades is one of many conservation organizations. Several are listed here. This is by no means the canonical list, but numerous organizations around the state have asked Governor DeSantis to veto this measure. I believe that we, correct me if I'm wrong, but before the show, we were just talking that we've had over 2,800 people from just Friends of the Everglades send an email to Governor DeSantis asking that he veto this legislation. So there's a considerable amount of public pressure on the governor here. You see down below here, Senator Nick DeSegli was the Senate sponsor of Senate Bill 540. Representative Wyman Duggan was the sponsor of House Bill 359, which was the House companion to this bill. virtually identical to 540. Duggan, it's important to note, is a Jacksonville attorney who represents developers. This is obviously something that favors the development community over local citizens. It disempowers local citizens. We think it would lead, if this becomes law, it's going to lead to much more reckless development. It's going to lead to a retreat by concerned citizens. And it's just bad news all the way around for Florida's environment, for, sustainable growth, for the idea of smart growth and smart planning. And as we've been saying all along here, and Eve, I'll let you jump in if you want to on this. Florida, everyone accepts the fact that Florida is going to continue to grow and must continue to grow, but that growth must be accomplished in a considered, very cautious and careful manner. This type of legislation totally undermines that.
Yeah, totally agree, Gil. I'll add two things. First, Florida is the fastest growing state in the country, and we used to be a leader in terms of growth management, responsible growth. The 1985 Growth Management Act that was advanced when Bob Graham was governor laid out some really useful protective measures to ensure that Florida grew in a sustainable way. Well, we've been eroding those protections in Florida virtually ever since, and most notably in 2011 when Governor Rick Scott dismantled the Department of Community Affairs, which was the state's lead growth management agency, and we've had death by 1,000 cuts ever since then. Arguably, these citizen challenges that Gil was just talking about are the last remaining backstop. If your local county commission passes a legally flawed amendment to its comprehensive plan, its blueprint for growth, that, for example, converts agricultural land to an industrial park, and this is based on a real example, you as an impacted citizen have a right to challenge that. You can ask an administrative law judge to determine that amendment was legally flawed. And as the law stands right now, you pay your own fees if you bring that challenge. You do have skin in the game. If this is signed into law by Governor DeSantis, you as a citizen would not only be on the hook for your own fees, as Gil mentioned, you'd also be on the hook for the local government's attorney's fees and potentially developers' attorney's fees. And we think that would have such a chilling effect on citizen challenges. What citizen could possibly bring a challenge with the threat of bankruptcy looming? These cases are often decided on a very narrow set of facts. So, and the last thing I'll say is we already have provisions in state law to prevent frivolous lawsuits. That's not what this is about. This is about greasing the skids for developers who are pushing to develop some of the last remaining and low-lying green spaces in Florida. We've seen it in South Miami-Dade. This is a terrible bill, and we hope Governor DeSantis listens to the many organizations and individuals who are asking him to veto it.
Yep. So this is bad news. Moving on, so is this. So you may have heard about this. This was in the last week of session. And the only reason we knew about this is because someone in the conservation community, God bless them, actually went through and was reading the hundreds of pages of the budget documents and happened to catch that there was a proviso snuck in one of these budget implementing bills that will effectively prohibit any county or municipality from adopting a new fertilizer control ordinance that has a blackout period. Like most of them have summertime blackout periods where you're not supposed to apply the fertilizer to keep nutrients out of waterways. This measure snuck into this budget bill would prohibit any new such ordinances for a year while IFAS, University of Florida Institute for Food and Agricultural Science, studies this. It was no, and this was done with no fanfare. This was done with no public debate or public input on this whatsoever. Like I said, it was just snuck into this bill. And ultimately, what's going to happen now, if this is signed, if the budget bill is signed by Governor DeSantis, again, we and numerous other organizations are asking him to veto specifically line item 146 in Senate Bill 2500, the appropriations bill, which would kill the funding for the IFAS study, $250,000. And if it does that, then the policy that will go along with the study will go away. The ban on new fertilizer bans, we're calling it. So this is bad news. There's been a lot of press on this. And it was Craig Pittman in the Florida Phoenix reported this past week something that had sort of long been rumored, which was that this got stuck in this bill at the behest of the company True Green. And it was done by a guy named Steve Crisafulli, who used to be Speaker of the Florida House, who is now a lobbyist for True Green. There's kind of a, you kind of got to know how to do these sorts of things, I guess. And he does. He's the kind of guy who does. And so obviously, I don't think anybody was meant to notice this. Thankfully, people did. And we've mounted this veto campaign. But the bottom line here is there's already some research out there from IFAS that suggests, now, whether this is definitive or not is an argument we can have. Certainly, it probably isn't. But there's already some research out there from IFAS that suggests that summertime fertilizer bans or blackout periods are not as effective in keeping nutrients out of waterways as wintertime blackout periods, because turf grass has less uptake of nutrients in the winter. It's not as active, that sort of thing. There's already some, in other words, there's already some, quote, science out there that suggests this, whether it's legit or not. It seems obvious that what we're looking for by sneaking this measure through the way it was snuck through, what seems pretty obvious is that friendly legislators, or legislators friendly to the cause of the fertilizer companies who want to sell more product, are thinking they're going to get more of the same. They're going to get affirmation of what, the previous study has already been shown, because $250,000 is not a tremendous lot of money to allot for, such a study. It stands to reason that what they're looking for is some way to undo fertilizer bans, or to at least prohibit future fertilizer bans. So this legislation, as I mentioned, if this goes through, if the budget goes through with this, if Governor DeSantis does not veto this, what it means is for the coming budget year, no municipality that does not have an ordinance will be able to adopt one with a blackout period. Those who already have such ordinances, and there's at least 50 such municipalities and counties around Florida who already have it, doesn't affect them. They're grandfathered in for now. But the fear is that what happens at the end of this 1 year period is they come back and they're going to say, well, look, we've got this study that shows these summertime blackout periods aren't effective. We're going to do away with that. We're going to, and theoretically anyway, we could see legislation prohibiting new bans, even trying to upend existing bans. So, and if that happens, it seems guaranteed it's going to result in more nutrients in our waterways, and our waterways simply can't handle that. Eve, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I just want to underscore what you said about how a former state lawmaker, not just a lawmaker, a leader in his chamber of the legislature, is now a registered lobbyist for a fertilizer company, True Green, that was seeking this pause on new fertilizer bans, ordinances with blackout dates, and got it tucked into the state budget that the current legislature advanced. And this has been reported by Craig Pittman of the Florida Phoenix, this connection between Steve Crisafulli, former House Speaker, and True Green. He's verifiably a registered lobbyist for True Green now. So, I mean, what Floridian would say that this represents doing the people's work in Tallahassee?
Indeed.
We have a known water crisis. We've grappled with toxic algae blooms repeatedly in Florida. We're looking at more algae blooms this summer, fish kills in Biscayne Bay and elsewhere. And one of the few things that local governments can do is to pass local ordinances limiting fertilizer application so that at least we curtail the problem a little bit. It doesn't even get at the agricultural problem, but in terms of fertilizer application in communities, residential areas, we can control what we can control. And this seeks to undercut that, to pause that, and potentially to do away with it altogether, depending on what this IFAS study determines and what the legislature does next. So it's really egregious. Sneak attack is absolutely the right term, and hope DeSantis vetoes this as well. And I'll just add, I'm looking at some of the comments. Hello to everyone watching. Thomas Portella says, I don't know if I can sit through this without getting mad. It is maddening. So,
Tom, I'm thinking the exact same thing, okay?
We feel your pain. Please stick with us because we have a little bit of good news later on.
All right. Moving right along. These are other pro-sprawl bills that passed. Senate Bill 718, very sort of friendly title, local government. This bill started out as a bill that would better regulate annexation, municipal annexation. Wasn't really something that we were overly concerned about, but lo and behold, with 2 weeks left in the session, this bill gets amended. There had been another pair of bills. You see it down here, House Bill 41, Senate Bill 856, that would prohibit local citizens' initiatives or referendums on land development regulations. I always give the example here. We're coming to you live from Martin County, where the city of Stuart has a 4-story height limit. Okay. Let's say that the city commission and the city of Stuart decided, we're going to do away with that. We're going to allow building up to 8 stories. And they write land development regulations that allow building up to 8 stories. Well, people locally would be angry about that and could, maybe even likely, to launch a referendum to rescind those land development regulations. Under this legislation, they would not be able to do that. They would be prohibited from doing so. So again, this bill started off, 718 started off as something far more innocuous. We were worried about House Bill 41, Senate Bill 856, but those stalled. Senate Bill 856 actually got pulled because there wasn't enough support in the Senate for it. We thought we dodged a bullet. We thought this bad idea was going to go die. Lo and behold, 2 weeks left in the session, Senate Bill 718 gets amended. That language is welded on to 718. 718 passes. So now, if Governor DeSantis signs this, again, this will prohibit citizen initiatives or referendum on land development regulations. Once again, disempowering citizens. Once again, tilting the playing field in favor of developers and development-friendly policies. If you're sensing a recurring theme here, you're onto something. Senate Bill 170, titled Local Ordinances. This makes it easier for businesses to sue local governments over ordinances that are deemed arbitrary or unfair. Actually, there's a specific term for it, which let me see if I can look it up here real quick. Allows them, it's just, and the ordinance has to affect the bottom line to a certain extent. In other words, a business has to be able to claim that they're losing a certain percentage of business as a result of the ordinance, in which case they can sue. The ordinance would go to, I guess, trial. And while it was under review, while the legal case was pending, the ordinance has to be suspended. If the business wins the case, the ordinance has to be rescinded. This is important for a lot of reasons, but consider what we just talked about with the ban on fertilizer bans. What happens if the Florida legislature next year comes back with legislation saying, we're going to do away with fertilizer bans, or we're going to say our new research shows that fertilizer bans are unnecessary, maybe even arbitrary. Would it be possible for a local business to turn around and sue a local government that has a fertilizer ban under Senate Bill 170 if this is in fact signed into law? It sounds like it would be possible on the basis of the language of this bill. This bill is yet another example of how Tallahassee, the state capital, the state government takes power away from local governments. It's called preemption, and we see this every single year. There are preemption bills up in Tallahassee. They were calling this bill the mother of all preemptions, specifically because it opens the door wide open to businesses that can plausibly claim that they are losing business as a result of some municipal or county regulation. So plastic bag ban, something like that. I mean, if it impacts the bottom line to a certain extent, yeah, maybe they can turn around and sue the local government. Maybe they can win. Maybe they can get rid of some of these ordinances. So Eve, feel free to jump in on these if you want.
I think you covered it on those. Bad news.
Yeah, bad news. There were, as mentioned, some good bills that unfortunately did not go anywhere. Chief on our list was the one on the top here, House Bill 423, Senate Bill 1538. This would have implemented some additional recommendations of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force. The Blue-Green Algae Task Force in Florida first issued its recommendations, I believe it was 2019. And there was a bill that year, I believe it was called the Clean Waterways Act, that adopted a few of the lowest hanging fruit from these recommendations, but there's a lot more. There's a lot of good stuff in the consensus document that the task force issued. And these two bills would have implemented more of the recommendations. Well, House Bill 423 didn't even get a hearing. Senate Bill 1538 got a single hearing, during which time what's called a strike all amendment was passed, which essentially gutted the bill, basically took almost everything out of it. And then after that, it was just ignored. So it didn't even go anywhere after that. So once again, this is the second year in a row for this legislation. This particular proposal it went nowhere last year, went nowhere this year. Third time's a charm, maybe. I don't know. We'll see. The Safe Waterways Act here, House Bill 177 and Senate Bill 172. This should be a no-brainer. This essentially requires public notification. If you own like some sort of swimming area, waterway, if the water is contaminated by fecal bacteria, it requires public notification. how is this even controversial? How is this a problem? But again, this is the second year in a row for this proposal. It went nowhere last year. Once again, it went nowhere this year. And down the bottom here, you see House Bill 175. It should be Senate Bill 192. Everglades Protection Area had added a layer of state oversight for comprehensive plan amendments within 2 miles of the Everglades Protection Area. This would apply in situations such as going on down in Miami-Dade with the South Dade Logistics and Technology Center proposal that would jump the urban development boundary down there and would actually be built, if it does get built, on land that's theoretically earmarked for Everglades restoration efforts. This would have required the state, basically review a lot of this information with a fine tooth. Doesn't require the state to reject it or anything like that, but it requires an additional state oversight. These bills looked like they were moving, but they were amended and watered down. Senate Bill 192 actually passed the full Senate, but died before the House could vote on it. So these ultimately went nowhere.
Yeah. Before you move on from those, Gil, first of all, thanks to the lawmakers who advanced some good bills. So Lindsey Cross is one of the lawmakers, Representative Lindsey Cross, that deserves to be thanked for the Blue-Green Algae Task Force bill. Unfortunately, it didn't go anywhere, as Gil said. And then Senator Ana Maria Rodriguez advanced the Everglades Protection Area bill, and we hope to see more progress from that in the future. And back to the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, this is so classic Florida, right? So the governor in 2019, right after taking office, Governor DeSantis rolled out an executive order, formed a Blue-Green Algae Task Force as a result of that order. That task force came out with recommendations in late 2019, and we participated with other groups in evaluating what percentage of those recommendations had been implemented. We did this last year. We put out a progress report. Only 12.5% of the recommendations have been implemented as of last year. And I have no reason to believe that number is higher now. So we need to follow through on the recommendations of these very wise, experienced scientists. These are the best academic minds, researchers in the state in terms of blue-green algae, which is toxic, which is a public health threat, an environmental threat, an economic threat. Let's follow through on the recommendations. It's not enough to form a task force. We've got to follow through. We hope to revisit this next session.
Agreed. And again, yeah, we'd like to see this legislation come back. But more than that, we'd like to see support for this legislation. We don't, particularly if, and Eva, I think, is going to talk a little bit about this later. We're facing the prospect of another major blue-green algae bloom on Lake Okeechobee this year. If we wind up with another blue-green algae crisis this year, it's going to underscore the fact that we've had a series of recommendations from Florida's top scientific experts as to how we might, address this, how we might stave some of these problems off, and we haven't taken their advice. And if we wind up with another crisis this summer, it may well be in part because we didn't take their advice, because we didn't follow their counsel, we didn't do what they said we should do. Here's a legislative attempt to sort of mandate that we begin taking those steps, and it can't, with the exception, it gets one hearing at which it gets gutted. It makes no sense. And unfortunately, we don't want to have to see another crisis before people begin to get the clue that maybe we actually need to act on these recommendations. So, all right. Well, after all that, let's talk about some good news. There was some good news out of Tallahassee this year. Chief among the good news is the fact that the worst bill of this year, or probably many years, these two bills, House Bill 1197 and Senate Bill 1240, went nowhere. These two bills appeared a little bit later on in the beginning of the session and immediately garnered all sorts of press attention, and rightfully so, because they, as noted here, they would have prevented municipalities and counties from establishing their own regulations on water quality, quantity, pollution control, and wetlands. It essentially would have handcuffed local government attempts to do anything about water quality in the neck of their woods, preempting all such authority to the state. It was a dangerous bill. These two bills, which were identical, this was a dangerous idea. This was an idea destined to result in more damage to Florida's waters, to the Everglades, to our entire ecosystem. They were ridiculous that these even got proposed as bills. There was a lot of press exposing this, mocking this, rightfully so. these bills wound up going nowhere. We and others in the conservation community spoke out loudly about these bills and the need that, for them not to go anywhere. Luckily, they did not go anywhere. So, and as we always say, bad ideas in Tallahassee, unfortunately, are like a vampire. They never truly die. They always rise again the next time. So we need to be vigilant and make sure this doesn't come back next session. It may well do that. But again, the rationale for this has been shredded. There's absolutely no credible rationale for telling a local government that they're not allowed to regulate water quality in their area, in their municipality or whatnot. Other than just thinking the state knows best. And as we've seen, the state does not know best on that. So there were some other regulations or some other bills here that are more of a mixed bag, as noted here. The state passed a new bill governing biosolids, House Bill 1405. Biosolids is what's left over after human waste is treated, for lack of a better term that we can use, poop. So when you flush a toilet, it's got to go somewhere. Something has to happen to it. It's transformed into what are called biosolids. It's very complex. There's class B biosolids, which are really bad. They're full of heavy metals. They're full of all sorts of. They can be full of pathogens. They're full of nutrients. And then there's class AA biosolids. The bill is going to facilitate the treatment of more class B biosolids into class A and class AA biosolids. In other words, it's going to take stuff that's really nasty and mandate that more of it be treated so it's less nasty. So that's good. But the problem is that the bill initially would have required greater care in monitoring and prohibitions on where class B biosolids, the really nasty stuff, is spread. Because you got to watch, a lot of this is used for fertilizers by farmers. Frankly, a lot of it's just dumped on farm fields by people who, the farmers get money, I guess, for this to be dumped on their land. But if it's dumped upstream of sensitive watersheds, this stuff gets into the waters. It's really bad news, can fuel algal blooms or worse. So the bill, and as initially proposed, would have enacted additional controls on how class B biosolids, the really bad stuff, is disposed of. But that got struck out of the bill. That was amended out of the bill during the process. And conservationists like us are concerned also because there are few, if any, prohibitions on where the better stuff, quote unquote, class AA biosolids, on where that can be spread, on how that's disposed of. It's better than the class B stuff, but it's still not good. You still don't want it, in your backyard, that sort of thing. But there's very little tracking of how this stuff is actually disposed of. Now, a lot of conservation groups said, look, shouldn't legislation like this have some provisions that would determine, govern where it can be spread, how it's spread, at least monitor that? It didn't have that. So it's sort of a half step forward sort of thing, but maybe a step, half step back too. It could have been much better. It's gonna be beneficial in the long run, I think, but it could have been much, much, much better. And then House Bill 1379 passed restrictions on septic systems in sensitive areas, in areas where there's a BMAP, a Basin Management Action Plan, which has been instituted by the state to help fix water quality in some of these bad areas. This legislation would prohibit new septic systems unless they are sort of things that really sort of do a really good job removing nutrients from water, and would mandate that households on septic hook up to sewer within a certain time frame. It's an incremental step, but it's better than nothing, I guess. And let me move on to this. And Eve, if you want to talk a little bit about this, sure. This is so all session long we've been viewing a lot of these session of sprawl bills through the lens of Governor DeSantis' Executive Order 2306, which you see part of here. This order was issued in January, and it proposed it's sort of purported to articulate DeSantis' clean water beliefs and priorities. And part of this talked about development and growth. And you can see this here. He's calling for the Department of Economic Opportunity and local governments to partner with DEP, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, to improve local government long-term comprehensive planning that assures sustainable growth, protecting our natural resources, protecting taxpayer investments in Everglades restoration projects, major land conservation and water quality protections programs. We asked on several occasions regarding some of these bills we just went over, does this comport with what Governor DeSantis said he wants in his executive order? Does this session of Sprawl, does Senate Bill 540 align with the values articulated here? I mean, Eve, our take is that absolutely not.
There's no honest way to say that they align with each other. You see the subtext here, the title of the executive order was Achieving Even More Now for Florida's Environment. We often see euphemistic language in executive orders or bills, and there's absolutely no way that we can say Senate Bill 540, Sprawl Bill 540 aligns with the language that's set out here. So we'll be watching this closely. In fact, we're tracking all of the provisions in this executive order. I mean, look, we're happy to see a governor issuing executive orders on the environment, calling for more. We need more in Florida, but let's not sugarcoat what's actually happening. So we're here. We're not only focused on legislative accountability, but we're focused on executive accountability in terms of the follow through on this executive order, as well as the governor's executive order from exactly 4 years before this one was signed. He signed one after taking office in 2019, January, and also this year in January. So we're watching both. And, Florida, I often think about an article that was written in Current Affairs, published in Current Affairs, called The Annihilation of Florida. And Jeff Vandermeer wrote that article, and it really just laid out what's at stake for our state and the greater Everglades occupying the whole southern half or more of the Florida Peninsula. Really, our very future as a state is at stake. We're on the front lines of climate change. We are implementing the most complex and expensive ecosystem restoration effort on the planet in Everglades restoration. And we are not doing ourselves any favors if we allow more reckless development to happen as we're grappling with these challenges, immense challenges. So that's what I would say about that. And let me just add, if you're watching live, please put questions in the comments. We're happy to get to as many of those as we can as we continue along here. I see many comments. Deborah Mitchell says, thank you for navigating the maze for us. We're happy to do it, Deborah. Or, I don't know, happy might be overstating it, but we take it seriously and we know it's vitally important. So Gil, having been mired in the weeds here, for months, 2 months, more than that, really, because committee meetings get started. I mean, what's your take on what we just saw? How did 2023 compare to last year, which also was a challenging session in Tallahassee?
Last year was a challenging session. The big one, obviously, that stands out from last year is Senate Bill 2508, which was the last second sneak attack that garnered so much attention when at the last minute they tried to sneak through some legislation that, among other things, would have solidified the sugar industry's hold on water policy and how water was managed in Lake Okeechobee. That generated quite an outcry sort of at the last minute. But, arguably the bit with the fertilizer ban, the ban on fertilizer bans this year is even worse. It's almost like they learned a lesson last year because Senate Bill 2508 at least had to have one hearing, at which dozens and dozens of people showed up. Well, here they managed to figure out a way to sneak a controversial piece of potential, policy making through without even a single hearing, So it's like they're learning the dark arts better or something. I don't know. It's just, you touched on this a little bit earlier. What we saw in Tallahassee when it pertains to these bills that we're talking about, they weren't doing the people's job. If you walked out on your sidewalk outside your house right now and you collared somebody and you said, hey, do you think that, in the case where, they passed a comprehensive plan amendment that's controversial, because almost all comprehensive plan amendments like that are controversial. And if you collared somebody in the street and said, do you think that you should be you should have to pay the other side's legal fees if you challenge this? They'd say, are you nuts? Are you crazy? No, of course not. Do you think that we ought to ban fertilizer bans, for a year? Why would we do that? Well, what's the rationale? None of these, things came from the people. None of this, came from constituents calling up their local representative, their senator, saying, hey, you got to do something about this. It's all stuff that favors, special interests over the people, unfortunately. And, again, where was the public clamor for Senate Bill 170, to allow local businesses to sue local governments over ordinances. I heard none. So it just seems that this legislative session in particular, as I said at the beginning of the show here, it almost seems like there was a concerted effort, by the sprawl industry to sort of an attack on all fronts, so to speak. We have numerous pieces of legislation that are going to take that ball down the field, lead to more reckless development, lead to the, citizens taking a step back from challenging some of these things, lead to greater opportunities to sprawl. And it was tough to follow it all. It was tough to sort of fight it on all fronts at the same time. Luckily some of those didn't make it to the finish line, but unfortunately others did. It was not a great session in terms of Florida's environment, but which sort of segues us, I guess, into the discussion on the budget here and how much is being allocated for land acquisition and that sort of thing. I mean, there's an argument, about that as to, how beneficial this is all going to be. But
yeah, I'll chime in there. So because there are so many moving parts and these policy measures that are advancing are so complex, we often see the headlines out of session on news stories focus on the dollar amounts in the budget as it relates to environmental spending. And it's just because people can understand numbers and track them year to year. So let's just briefly talk about the state budget and what it means for our cause. So the state passed a $117 billion budget. It's the largest in Florida history, and it included $1.6 billion for water and Everglades projects. So you'll see some politicians and some groups touting the sheer spending. We take a much more nuanced view of the budget allocations. The devil is really in the details on what this money is going for. So, for example, we are happy to see money going to Florida Forever. Florida Forever got $100 million, and that's a worthwhile, very beloved land buying program to protect some of Florida's most precious natural lands. That's important. Actually, we'd like to see it higher. It was about $300 million a year when Jeb Bush was governor, but okay, we're happy to see money spent on Florida Forever. However, some of this $1.6 billion included $50 million for what's known as the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Plan, LORP. It's a terrible acronym. There are a lot of those in this world. It's north of Lake Okeechobee, and this plan includes about 50 aquifer storage and recovery wells, ASR wells. I think I have that number right, 50, Gil? 50 or 80.
So, yes.
Yeah. Dozens of aquifer storage and recovery wells. And there's scientific questions about sending water down deep into the aquifer and then retrieving it for later use. And in our view, that's not really environmental spending. That's water storage for agricultural landowners who want to be able to retrieve water later. So, and another example of what that money went for, the $1.6 billion, is $64 million for the EAA Reservoir project. Friends of the Everglades has made no secret of our concerns about the engineering design of that project, 37-foot high embankment walls, 23 feet deep of water. In fact, the National Academy of Sciences issued a report in December that also raised some questions about whether that reservoir project will function as effectively as it was billed to the public because of some related water quality concerns. So, we could go through the whole list of environmental spending in the budget. It is also a mixed bag. But when you see those numbers in the headlines, just think about what the variety of spending that it entails. And I just encourage everyone not to accept bigger numbers as a bigger win. That's just not always the case. Throwing
money at the problem is not going to solve it.
Not alone. Yeah.
Not alone. Exactly.
Yeah. So Gil, you mentioned how residents have responded. And again, I just want to thank everyone who's listening to this today, taking your lunch hour to bone up on environmental policy, a lot of it depressing in Florida, because it is so important that we all keep our eyes wide open to this. Almost 3,000 Friends of the Everglades supporters sent veto requests to the governor. We've heard a lot of outrage and disappointment, a lot of concern about the future of the Everglades and our water in general. Gil, in your capacity at VoteWater, what kind of feedback have you gotten from people following this along?
Well, I think people have been upset and angry, and we've seen a little bit of that reflected in our comments here today. Again, it just doesn't. Some of this stuff just doesn't make a lot of sense from a citizen's perspective. Why are we doing this? Why are we making it more difficult for citizens to be engaged with the process? Right? Citizens play a crucial role when it comes to oversight of how their local communities develop. Right? And they can be involved, politically. They can run for office, they can come to meetings, that sort of thing. But their opportunity to challenge some of these decisions that they see as bad decisions, after those decisions have been made, again, it serves as a crucial check and balance on reckless development. Right? Because who has a bigger stake in what happens locally in their community than the people who live there? Well, what we've seen this session, again, is attempts to curtail that, is attempts by the sprawl industry and compliant legislators to push away these pesky citizens, get them out of the way, because they tend to stand in the way of, just the sprawl machine just rolling over the landscape. And, I think people are angry about that. I think people are upset about that, and they're right to be upset about that. There's ample reason to be upset when your state government is attempting to disempower you and ensure that you have less of a say in what's happening in your community, the place where you live, the place where you've invested your money in your home, the place where you're raising your kids. Your legislature this year, with several of these bills, has said, you know what, you have too much of a stake in that. We need to lower your stake in your community. We need to lower your own authority in your own community. And we see that with these bills. So the feedback that we've gotten is that people are outraged about this, and they're right to be outraged. They should be outraged about this. And legislators need to know that they're outraged about this. Legislators need to know we're not going to stand for this. We're not going to let you take away our rights, and we're certainly going to raise a ruckus if you try. So, that's where it's good that we see, with the veto campaigns that have been going on now with numerous conservation organizations. It's good to hear citizens speak up and say, no, don't do this. We're not, we're watching. We know what's going on. We're watching. We're educated, and we're going to speak out. And people should. People have to. So,
yeah, and all of this occurred with a looming algae threat. And it predicted in Florida. So you mentioned this earlier, and I'll zoom in a little bit, Gil. Lake Okeechobee, water managers are predicting a bad algae bloom, a severe algae bloom on Lake Okeechobee this spring or summer. And we have actually already seen algae flashing on the west side of the lake, east side of the lake, just on the other side of the Port Mayaca Lock and Dam. In fact, the Martin County Health Department issued an advisory about a week ago due to the toxin microcystin testing at elevated levels there. It wasn't at the level that the EPA or World Health Organization recommends not touching, but it was not too far off of that. So things could get a lot worse as water temperatures heat up this summer. Nutrient pollution continues to run into Lake Okeechobee through tropical weather, the rainy season. And then as the lake rises, we have an increased risk that the floodgates will open east to the St. Lucie River and west wider to the Caloosahatchee. The Caloosahatchee needs some dry season flows and has been getting them, but neither coast wants a deluge of polluted water carrying toxic algae into our communities. That's what we saw in 2018 and 2016. It's a public health threat. And for the legislature to be taking steps to make fertilizer application easier, even as we're facing this public health threat, is absolutely egregious. And I'll add too, we had an unprecedented manatee die-off in Florida in the Indian River Lagoon over the past year and a half or so. So that threat has not completely gone away. There were fewer manatee deaths during the year that just ended, but still a lot more than we should have. So we'll be watching the algae bloom too. You can tune in at everglades.org, and I know VoteWater will be following that along. If we do have a severe crisis, we need to raise our voices even louder about reforming policy. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I think we have time for a question or two, and then we'll look ahead to next legislative session. And I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but they're going to meet earlier next year in January. Committee hearings are going to start in the fall, so we're only 4 or 5 months off from seeing some action from the legislature again. All right, so Allie Hartman is our communications director behind the scenes. Thanks for directing the show today, Allie. We'll take a question. All right. Michael Underwood asks, "What's the story on seagrass restoration?" So I'll tee it up by talking about what happened last year, Gil, and if you want to talk about the seagrass bill that was filed
Sure.
this year, that'd be great. Okay. So last year, there was a bad bill filed related to seagrass mitigation that would have made it easier to build a dock, for example, and destroy seagrass so long as you planted seagrass elsewhere to compensate for the loss. The problem with that is seagrass is notoriously hard to replant to ensure that it thrives in the long term. And in addition to that, we need seagrass wherever we can get it. If it's growing and thriving, we need to protect it where it is. The manatee die-off that I just mentioned is directly related to a loss of seagrass. We've had essentially forests of seagrass wiped out in Florida waterways. And what we saw last year wasn't good. Luckily, we and other groups helped kill that bad bill last year. And this year, a bill was filed that relates to seagrass. I'll let you answer that, Gil.
Yeah, no, it actually passed. This was Senate Bill 724, was signed by Governor DeSantis. Senate Bill 724 establishes a, quote, seagrass restoration technology development initiative within FDEP in partnership with Mote Marine Laboratory and the University of Florida to develop new technologies to restore seagrass. It creates a 10-year Florida seagrass restoration plan, which requires annual reports to the governor, FDP secretary, et cetera, and also establishes an initiative technology advisory council. So we're going to study the problem, and which is good, I guess. You know, we need to know a little bit more about exactly what's going on and how we're going to overcome it. The problem is, as Eve said, seagrass is notoriously difficult to grow, and the conditions that lead to the demise of seagrass, which is nutrient pollution, turbidity in the water, you know, unless we study how to greatly reduce those factors, we're going to have a hard time regrowing seagrass. So there seems to be, with this and some other things, blue-green algae, for example, there seems to be growing reliance or growing hope that technology is going to somehow save us. Again, this is in part to sort of discover how new technology might help in the fight to restore seagrass. It's a great idea, don't get me wrong. You know, if we can come up with some sort of technological solution, I'm not sure what that would be, but maybe the studies can Mote Marine and the UF can come up with something. But until we do something about nutrient pollution and turbidity in the water, we're kind of going to be spinning our wheels to a certain extent. I mean, those are two of the biggest factors in terms of seagrass loss. So,
yeah, the state seems susceptible to the temptation to deploy innovative technology, quote unquote, to address these kinds of problems that we've been talking about for the last 50 minutes. Another example of that is in treating algae blooms. So the state has deployed tens of millions of dollars to use, quote unquote, innovative technology to treat blue-green algae blooms that emerge. And these can involve hydrogen peroxide type solutions, algicides of other nature. And as the Blue-Green Algae Task Force has said repeatedly, we don't know what the unintended consequences are of some of these technological remedies. And we do know that the good old-fashioned method of limiting pollution to begin with is not harmful and should be employed. So we'll continue to push for that. And you know, if we find that an innovation can be safely implemented, then great, let's layer that on top. But we can't sacrifice preventing the disease to begin. We got to treat the disease, not the symptoms, right?
exactly.
All right. So let's see. I see a lot of comments in the chat here. Not too many questions. We may have overwhelmed everyone, Gil. I know we put a lot out there. So unless we get another question in the next few minutes, I think I'll ask you, Gil, and then I'll weigh in too, to think ahead to the 2024 session. You know, what are you going to be watching for in the year ahead, hoping for? How can we be more effective as environmental advocates in the future?
I think, well, first off, next year, I think we're going to see a lot of the legislation that died this year come back. I hope we don't see those two really, really terrible bills I mentioned. That was Senate Bill, House Bill 1197 and Senate Bill 1240. That's like the ones that would prohibit local water quality rules. I hope we don't see those resurrected, but we may. You know, we may see some of the good bills that went nowhere resurrected, the Blue-Green Algae Task Force. You know, although will they have suffer any different fate next year than they did the last 2 years? It's hard to say. It's hard to say. But against this backdrop, again, you go back to the possibility of a significant blue-green algae bloom on Lake Okeechobee this year. If that winds up happening, it's going to create a necessary sort of momentum, a necessary sense of crisis, that something be done, in which case maybe our legislators will actually take the problem seriously if events force them to do so. I don't want to say that will be good, because no one wants to endure a crisis. And you sometimes wish it didn't take a crisis to focus people's minds on how we might prevent the next crisis, because that's what we're talking about. What we ultimately need to be able to do is get legislators to change the way they think about these issues, which is that they're not responding to an acute crisis now, but they understand that inaction means there's going to be additional crises down the line, and we have to act. We have to do something to prevent those from happening, because we can't get caught flat-footed, which has happened. Has happened. It happened 2013, happened 2016, happened 2018. It's like, would these things happen to us? Well, no, these things aren't just happening to us. We could have done something to mitigate them, and we've chosen not to do that. We need to choose the opposite. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know we have a question on phosphogypsum. It's a good one we'll get to. And I just want to add, Gil, you'll recall that when you and I were in Tallahassee in April, we met with lawmakers, including some who I won't name here, who had no idea that a bill had been passed to implement the Blue-Green Algae Task Force recommendations. And that's a real problem. So I'm going to safely predict right now that more lawmakers are going to know about these kinds of things in the future, because we're going to be there earlier telling them about it.
Yes.
They know. And, whether they really didn't know, and there were a ton of bills flying, most of them not environmental this session, a lot of distractions, whether they were being honest or not, we just need to make sure they can't dodge that. When good bills are filed, they need to embrace them and carry them forward and schedule them for committee hearings.
Yeah, that's one thing that people may not realize, and that I don't think I realized until we started paying as much attention to it, is the sheer volume of legislation that is proposed in Tallahassee every year. We're talking thousands, maybe several thousands of proposed bills, legislation. You have situations where legislators are voting on legislation that they've never read, that they are not familiar with. It's not a stretch to say that we make new laws in Florida that ultimately get maybe 45 minutes of attention from the legislature. Now, there's others that are more controversial, that have amendments, and that they have floor debate. And there's many, and a lot of the culture war bills this time around in particular, took up a lot of time, where people discussed them and debated them and argued, all that sort of thing. But there's a lot of legislation in Florida that just flies through. And if you don't notice it, if you don't know what you're looking for, and even legislators, as Eve just said, don't really understand what's out there, So that is a job, for organizations like ours to do more to educate the legislators on what's out there, why we think they should vote for it, and so forth.
Yep, absolutely. All right, we'll take that question on phosphogypsum. Let's see. Michelle Lester. Hi, Michelle. Have we heard if the bill allowing phosphogypsum to build roads was vetoed or not by the governor? Gil, you want to take that one?
I do not believe it has yet been passed or vetoed. This one, as you probably know, involves the legislature saying that, hey, we think it's a good idea to use this radioactive stuff that's stacked hundreds of feet high now in some of these disposal sites. We think it's a good idea to use that to build roads. And the legislature passed this. There is a veto campaign. Eve, do you know the number of that legislation off the top of your head? It's not 1196.
I don't,
Yeah.
But we can look it up quickly. But Friends of the Everglades also signed on to a veto request on that measure. It didn't directly impact the Everglades per se, but it was such an egregious bill that we really certainly oppose it.
This is House Bill 1191. It has been passed by both houses. It's being sent to the governor. So what will the governor do? As Eve said, there is a veto campaign. And this was something that under Trump, when Trump was the president, the EPA was going to allow this. And then when Biden became president, the EPA wasn't going to allow this. And now this bill would allow it in Florida. Authorizes the Department of Transportation to undertake demonstration projects using phosphogypsum in road construction aggregate materials. So this has launched like 1,000 memes, people online, wiseacres online saying, they're giving Florida's roads a glowing review, that sort of thing. It's obviously a bad idea, but bad ideas tend to flourish, unfortunately, in Florida and the Florida legislature. So I don't know. There is a vigorous veto campaign trying to convince DeSantis to veto this one as well. Will he? I don't know. I guess
it should be said, this is a byproduct of fertilizer production.
It is. This is a byproduct of the fertilizer industry. When you mine the rock that they get the fertilizer from, apparently it creates, for every 1 ton of fertilizer, it creates like 3 tons of this waste, phosphogypsum, which is at this point just piled in these stacks, like the one around Piney Point. And there tend to be, water inside these stacks, processed water, that sort of thing. That was the problem with Piney Point. That water started leaking out because the stacks started to collapse. There have been all sorts of environmental issues regarding the phosphate industry, the mining industry, and phosphogypsum. This is an attempt to find something to do with this surplus material. And it sounds like it creates a new revenue source for the mining companies. They actually, instead of waste, they're actually be able to sell this stuff to the state government, which would then use it to build roads. It's a great idea, except for the fact that it's a terrible idea.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It was an important one, Michelle. So we're at an hour now. I want to thank everyone again who tuned in. If you have not yet sent a veto request to Governor DeSantis on SB 540, Sprawl Bill 540, please do so now. Go to everglades.org. You can send a custom message in addition to our message. There's still time. He's not taken action on that. And he has until May 24th to either sign, veto, or let that bill become law without his signature. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gil, for all your hard work this session. I know it takes a toll, but it's really important. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank all of you folks for caring enough to be here and to be paying attention. That's what we need. That's what we need.
Yeah. All right. We'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.